On March 13th, 2026, the United States military bombed a tiny island that most people couldn't find on a map. And within hours, the financial shockwaves reached every corner of the globe. Kharg Island, a flat coral outcrop roughly 25 kilometers off Iran's southern coastline in the Persian Gulf, handles approximately 90% of Iran's total crude oil exports. U.S. Central Command destroyed over 90 military targets there in a single coordinated raid. But the most consequential part of this story isn't what was destroyed. It's what was deliberately left standing. And the decision to spare Kharg's oil infrastructure has set in motion a chain of escalation that now threatens global energy stability in ways we haven't experienced in modern history. To understand why this matters, not just to governments and military strategists, but to anyone who buys gasoline, pays an electricity bill, or purchases goods that travel by ship, you need to grasp two things. First, what Kharg Island actually represents. And second, what the Strait of Hormuz means to the world economy. Because right now, one of those is intact but under explicit threat, and the other is functionally closed. Together, those two realities are rewriting the rules of global oil markets in real time. Kharg Island doesn't look like much from the air. It's small, low-lying, and unremarkable in the way that so many critical pieces of global infrastructure tend to be. But along its coastline sits a network of loading docks, storage tanks, and pipeline terminals that constitutes the beating heart of Iran's entire petroleum economy. Total storage capacity on the island sits at approximately 30 million barrels, with an estimated 18 million barrels held in inventory as of early March 2026. For Tehran, Kharg isn't simply an export hub. It's the financial foundation that funds the government, sustains the military apparatus, and bankrolls Iran's extensive network of regional proxies across the Middle East. Without Kharg functioning, Iran's economy doesn't gradually weaken, it collapses. That reality is what made the American targeting decisions on March 13th so heavily loaded with strategic meaning. When U.S. bombers hit the island, they struck naval mine storage facilities, missile bunkers, radar installations, and dozens of military hardpoints distributed across the landscape. Over 90 distinct targets were destroyed in a single operation, a comprehensive dismantling of the island's defensive military capability. But the oil terminals, the tank farms, the crude loading infrastructure, all of it was left untouched. The message from Washington was calibrated with precision. We possess the capability to shut down your economy in an afternoon, and we are showing you that we have chosen not to exercise that capability yet. President Trump made sure that implicit warning became fully explicit. In public remarks following the strikes, he cautioned that he might target Kharg's oil infrastructure directly if Iran continues to interfere with international shipping. Then he added a line that sent tremors through diplomatic channels worldwide, stating he may hit the island a few more times just for fun. Whether that language was calculated provocation or unfiltered impulse, the effect was the same. It injected a layer of unpredictability into the crisis that neither markets nor governments can easily model or plan around. And that unpredictability is precisely what shaped what came next. Iran's response arrived fast, and it arrived on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched volleys of missiles and armed drones at targets inside Israel and at American military installations scattered across the region. Tehran publicly downplayed the physical damage to Kharg, framing the strikes as largely ineffective, a familiar posture for governments absorbing military blows while quietly preparing escalation of their own. But Iran's true counterpunch wasn't kinetic in the conventional sense. It was geographic. Iran moved to close the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is, by any serious measure, the single most critical choke point in the global energy system. At its narrowest, it stretches just 33 kilometers across, with usable shipping lanes that compress international tanker traffic into corridors so confined that navigating them requires precision even under peacetime conditions. On any given day, approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply transits this waterway. Not 20% of Middle Eastern production, 20% of all oil traded on the planet. When the Strait of Hormuz closes, the repercussions don't stay regional. They cascade through every economy that depends on petroleum, which is to say, virtually every economy on Earth. Iran has deployed a layered denial strategy to enforce its blockade. Naval mines scattered across established shipping lanes, armed drone patrols covering the surface approaches, and close-range anti-ship missiles positioned along the Iranian coastline overlooking the strait. This is a playbook Tehran has refined over decades, drawing on lessons from the tanker war of the 1980s, when Iranian forces mined the Gulf and attacked commercial vessels during the Iran-Iraq conflict. The difference now is that the technology is more precise, the weapons more lethal, and the political will to sustain the closure appears absolute. Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei has vowed publicly to keep the strait shut as a tool of maximum economic pressure, designed to force every oil-importing nation on the planet to share in the cost of this conflict. For the moment, that strategy is holding. Tanker traffic through Hormuz has ground to a near halt, and the passage that carries a fifth of the world's crude is, for all practical purposes, closed. The market reaction has been historic. And that word is chosen deliberately. Brent crude and WTI futures surged more than 40% during March 2026, reaching their highest levels since 2022. According to multiple analysts and reporting from Reuters, this represents the largest oil supply disruption ever recorded in global energy markets. Not the largest in a decade or since the Gulf War, the largest in the history of modern oil trading. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has projected that Brent crude will remain above $95 a barrel for at least the next 2 months, driven directly by the conflict and the Hormuz blockade. Their longer-range forecast suggests a potential decline toward $70 by year-end, but that projection rests on assumptions that right now look increasingly fragile. A reopened strait, some form of negotiated settlement, and no further major escalation. Goldman Sachs, meanwhile, has raised its fourth quarter 2026 Brent forecast to $71 a barrel, reflecting a scenario where the crisis eventually de-escalates, but leaves lasting structural damage to supply chain confidence and market stability. To absorb the immediate shock, the International Energy Agency authorized a record release of 400 million barrels from strategic petroleum reserves across its member nations, the largest coordinated stockpile drawdown ever attempted in the history of the organization. And even with that massive intervention in play, prices remain sharply elevated, volatility remains extreme, and the futures curve tells the story of a market pricing in sustained disruption rather than a quick resolution. If this is reshaping how you understand what's actually happening in the Persian Gulf right now, drop your perspective in the comments, because the range of possible outcomes from here is enormous, and the debate over what comes next is far from settled. The United States is not simply absorbing the economic damage and waiting for conditions to shift. The Trump administration has launched an aggressive diplomatic campaign to assemble a multinational naval coalition capable of reopening the strait by force. President Trump has publicly called on China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom to deploy warships to the Hormuz corridor, framing it as a shared responsibility. These are countries whose economies run on Gulf oil, so they should shoulder the military burden of keeping the waterway open. The logic is clean from Washington's vantage point. The problem is that logic and military commitment are very different things when the waterway in question is an active combat zone, with mines drifting beneath the surface and anti-ship missiles positioned on the shoreline. The United Kingdom has been the most responsive among allied nations, but even London's posture remains cautious. British officials have stated they are examining, quote, any options, including the possible deployment of minesweeping drones, advanced autonomous systems designed to locate and neutralize underwater mines without risking manned vessels. But no firm commitment to deploy crude warships into the strait has been confirmed. France has signaled willingness to participate in a broader coalition, but has attached a significant condition. It wants the security situation to stabilize before committing forces. That creates an obvious circular problem. The security environment won't stabilize without naval intervention, but Paris won't intervene until stability is established. China, Japan, and South Korea have given no indication whatsoever that warships are being readied. For Beijing in particular, the strategic calculus is exceptionally delicate. China remains one of the largest purchasers of Iranian crude oil, and sending naval forces to operate alongside the United States in a campaign to break an Iranian blockade would represent a dramatic realignment that contradicts virtually every principle of China's carefully cultivated Middle East posture. There is no realistic scenario where Beijing joins a US-led naval coalition without fundamentally redefining its relationships across the region, and no serious evidence suggests that calculation is under consideration in Chinese strategic circles. So as of mid-March 2026, the multinational coalition President Trump has called for does not exist in any operational form. American forces are conducting military operations in the Gulf largely on their own footing, with rhetorical expressions of support from certain allies, but nothing approaching the broad, sustained naval presence that would be required to clear mines from shipping lanes, escort commercial tankers through the strait, and maintain a persistent security umbrella over one of the most tactically dangerous maritime environments in the world. And if you're following this and not yet subscribed, now is the moment, because what unfolds in the Strait of Hormuz over the coming weeks will shape energy prices, alliance structures, and economic conditions well into 2027. Meanwhile, Iran has expanded its threat perimeter well beyond the strait. Tehran has warned that it will target what it calls American hideouts in the United Arab Emirates, a barely veiled reference to the extensive U.S. military infrastructure housed across the country. More alarmingly, Iran has explicitly threatened to strike energy infrastructure owned by oil companies cooperating with the United States. That is not abstract rhetoric. It is a direct threat to the physical assets of multinational energy corporations, refineries, export terminals, pipeline networks, processing facilities, spread across the Gulf states from the UAE to Saudi Arabia to Qatar. The UAE's critical port infrastructure is now operating under heightened threat levels. Jebel Ali, the largest commercial port in the Middle East and among the busiest in the world, handles cargo far beyond petroleum, electronics, consumer goods, manufacturing components, food supplies. Khalifa Port and Fujairah are similarly exposed. A sustained Iranian strike campaign against these facilities would not simply disrupt oil markets. It would rip through global supply chains in ways that touch manufacturing, retail, food distribution, technology, and international logistics on a massive scale. For companies with operations, assets, or supply chain dependencies in the Gulf, the risk environment has fundamentally shifted in a matter of days. Maritime insurance premiums for vessels transiting the region have spiked dramatically. Corporate evacuation protocols are being activated at facilities across the UAE and Bahrain. Supply chain managers are scrambling to reroute cargo away from Hormuz-dependent corridors, primarily through the far longer passage around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. A detour that adds 2 to 3 weeks of transit time and substantially increases shipping costs for every cargo that takes it. Those costs don't remain with the shipping companies. They pass through to manufacturers, to wholesalers, to retailers, and ultimately to consumers at the checkout counter. This is the dimension of the crisis that often gets buried beneath coverage focused on warships and missile strikes. The economic pain is not theoretical, and it is not contained to the Persian Gulf. When a fifth of the world's oil supply is disrupted, and the primary maritime corridor for Middle Eastern commerce is threatened, the costs distribute across the entire global economy. Fuel prices surge at the pump. Electricity generation costs climb in every country dependent on oil and natural gas. Transportation expenses increase across every mode: maritime, air, and ground freight. Manufacturing inputs grow more expensive as raw materials and components face delays and price markups. Agricultural costs rise because modern farming depends on fuel for machinery, processing, and distribution networks. Inflation pressures that had been gradually easing through late 2025 in many Western economies are now surging back into urgent policy discussions at central banks from Washington to Frankfurt to Tokyo. And what makes all of this even more precarious is the diplomatic vacuum sitting at the center of the crisis. Despite the escalating military confrontation and the compounding economic damage, there is no active ceasefire negotiation underway. There is no functioning back channel producing results. There is no international mediator with the credibility, access, and leverage necessary to bridge the gap between Washington and Tehran. The Trump administration has actively rebuffed attempts by Middle Eastern governments to initiate ceasefire discussions. According to multiple reports, President Trump stated that while Tehran appears ready for a deal, the terms aren't good enough yet. That framing, treating an active military conflict with a closed maritime choke point and convulsing global energy markets as a negotiation where the United States simply holds out for better terms, has generated alarm across regional capitals and in European foreign ministries alike. The diplomatic off-ramps that typically emerge during crises of this magnitude: quiet UN Security Council consultations, back-channel mediation through neutral states like Oman or Qatar, private communications between adversaries through trusted intermediaries, are either absent, blocked, or producing nothing. And as long as that vacuum persists, the default trajectory is continued escalation. Every day the strait stays closed, the economic damage compounds. Every day without diplomacy, the positions harden further. And every day that mines remain in the water and missiles sit on their launchers, the probability of a catastrophic miscalculation, a sunk commercial tanker, an accidental strike on civilian infrastructure, a mass casualty event that triggers another cycle of retaliation, increases. The strategic architecture of this crisis has a quality that makes it uniquely dangerous. Both sides are attempting to internationalize different dimensions of the conflict, and neither is succeeding. Iran's closure of Hormuz is engineered to spread economic pain across the globe, forcing oil-importing nations to pressure Washington toward de-escalation. The United States is trying to distribute the military burden, compelling allies to deploy naval forces and accept shared security risk. Both strategies depend on third parties fundamentally changing their behavior. And so far, third parties are doing what they often do in the early phase of a major crisis: watching carefully, deliberating internally, hedging their positions, and waiting to see which direction the wind shifts before committing. The result is a strategic stalemate layered on top of an active military conflict, with the global economy absorbing the full cost of the impasse in real time. One detail within this crisis deserves particularly close attention: the preservation of Kharg Island's oil infrastructure. That decision was not incidental. It was the centerpiece of the American strategy. By leaving the oil terminals and storage facilities intact, Washington has maintained a form of coercive leverage, the ever-present threat that a single additional strike package could deliver a catastrophic blow to Iran's economic foundation. It is a sword held visibly overhead. But that restraint also means Iran retains the physical capacity to resume full-scale crude exports the moment conditions allow, which in theory creates an incentive for Tehran to negotiate, rather than watch its infrastructure get systematically dismantled. The question is whether that incentive structure holds under pressure. If Iran concludes that the United States will eventually strike the oil facilities regardless of what Tehran does, the motivation to negotiate evaporates, and the incentive to escalate further, extracting maximum strategic damage before those facilities are lost, grows sharply. If the U.S. holds back indefinitely, the coercive value of the threat gradually erodes as Iran calculates that Washington is bluffing. It is an extraordinarily narrow strategic corridor, and both sides are navigating it with limited visibility, domestic political pressures, and stakes that could not be higher. For anyone trying to make sense of what comes next, the timeline splits into 3 distinct phases. In the immediate term, the next 7 to 14 days, the critical variable is whether the Strait of Hormuz remains fully closed or whether limited tanker transits resume under some improvised form of escort. Oil prices will stay above $95 a barrel as long as the blockade holds, and the strategic reserve drawdown will buy time but cannot solve the underlying supply disruption on its own. In the short term, roughly 1 to 4 weeks out, the decisive question is whether a credible multinational naval coalition materializes. If the United Kingdom, France, or other significant maritime powers commit actual forces to mine clearing and convoy escort operations, the dynamic changes significantly. If they don't, the U.S. faces a stark choice between attempting to reopen the strait unilaterally, with all the escalation risk that entails, or tolerating a prolonged closure that bleeds the global economy day after day. And in the medium term, 1 to 3 months from now, the outcome hinges entirely on diplomacy. Either a negotiated framework emerges that produces a ceasefire, mutual de-escalation, and eventual reopening of the strait, or this conflict settles into a grinding standoff that reshapes energy markets, trade routes, insurance models, and alliance structures for years to come. If someone in your life needs to understand why fuel costs are climbing, why goods are getting more expensive, and what's actually driving the instability rippling through global markets right now, share this with them. Because the forces at work here are going to define the economic reality of the rest of 2026, and very likely well beyond it. The strikes on Kharg Island were precise and calculated. The closure of Hormuz was predictable and predicted. The Allied hesitation was entirely foreseeable. But whether this crisis finds a ceiling or breaks through into something the global economy has never had to absorb depends on decisions that have not yet been made by leaders who are rapidly running out of room to maneuver. That gap between what has already happened and what might still be coming is where the real danger lives. And right now, no one can say with confidence which way it breaks.